series that we're doing, we've been listening to so many podcasts and reading books, like way more research than normal. And last week, because we're in the grief week, I was listening to this interview, see if we could use it for the service. And it was this interview of, not a Christian podcast, but it was this interview of a comedian who had done this stand-up act that centered around the death of his 34-day-old son, which, if you ask me, sounds like a strange choice to do a stand-up act about. But the way he kind of like explained it wasn't just comedy, it was like a way of him to process his grief and honor the death of his son. And as he's telling the story about this, he shares that when they got the news for the first time of the death of their son, his wife said, "How am I ever going to be happy again?" And I've never gone through anything as awful and painful as that, and yet I've thought that thought many times. That's been my personal experience with depression. We're in the middle of this White Flag series looking at mental health issues, and today we're talking about depression. And kind of like the main idea that we've been wrestling through this series is that it's okay to not be okay, and Jesus wants to make us whole. What I want to do this morning is kind of like explore depression for a little bit. What does it mean to be not okay? What's depression? And then maybe look at the scriptures for some things, how Jesus can meet us in the midst of this. I think that one of the misconceptions about depression is that sometimes it feels like it just means that people are really sad. If you asked me before I experienced depression myself, my first thought would have been Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh, which it's literally a caricature of what people's experience with depression is. It's more complex than that. I actually went to the NIH's website to pull out kind of like how they define depression. This is what I say. Depression is a common but serious mood disorder. It causes severe symptoms that affect how a person feels, thinks, and handles daily activities such as sleeping, eating, or working. To be diagnosed with depression, symptoms must be present for at least 2 weeks. So the way we think about depression today, at least clinically, is not just a feeling of sadness, but it's a combination of how we feel and how persistent that feeling is that then affects our ability to function in the world. Actually, this is from the same website, some of the symptoms of depression, right? We have, persistent sad mood and feelings of hopelessness. You scroll all the way down to the end, you get to thoughts of death or suicide attempts. Christian writer John Mark Comer defines depression this way. He says, depression is when sorrow becomes a way of life, not a phase. When joy, hope, and life are snuffed out of your soul. When you're sad for no reason at all. When no matter how hard you try, fight, and work, you can't pull yourself out of a bad mood. When you wake up sad. When the day grows worse with each passing hour. When family and friends are distant. When you're tired all the time. When dreams and desires for the future die and all motivation and energy is gone, when life is really, really horrible, depression is emotional, it infects and ruins the realm of the soul. It's more than just feeling sad. And I know that from a personal experience. I've shared a little bit about this, but back in 2016, we're living in Washington, D.C. My wife and I moved there to start the church, and things are going great. We're kind of like beginning. We're not meeting publicly yet, but we're building a team and raising money, and things are awesome. Like actually, we had just gotten like this giant mega church to come and support us, and they gave us like this very big financial grant that was really going to kind of like set us up and help us. And around the month of November, right after this happens, it felt like we hit a wall. Like everything became harder. Like all the momentum that we were having kind of like stopped. We were struggling to meet people. Some of the doors that we thought were open started closing. And I started feeling this pressure of the expectations that people had on me and on what we were doing, the fact that people had entrusted us with money, that some people had moved to help us with this, and the difficulty and the lack of results. And that pressure started just crushing me. And it started crushing me to the point that it affected my mental health, that I was always sad that I couldn't get out of bed. I remember like my wife would go to work, and I would kind of like sit in the living room and pray, and I wouldn't move from the couch for 2 hours. Not because I was being lazy, because I couldn't move. Like I had no motivation to do anything. I was terrified. I was afraid of taking a step. And an incredibly dark period of time. And at one point, my wife, a couple months later, sort of like staged like a one-on-one intervention. She's like, you need to get help. You need to do something. This cannot go on like that. And that took me on a journey of about 2 years of therapy and counseling and, yes, medication that helped me kind of like get to some form of a pre-2016 winter me. Then, in 2022, our church closed. And I was home taking care of a 7th-month-old, 8th-month-old at this point, boy, and all that came back like a wrecking ball. And it got to a point that I needed to get help again. And, it lasted a few months, and, things got better. And the reason why I'm telling you this, because I want you to know that I'm coming to this topic from, not from a detached outsider's perspective, but something that I'm unfortunately intimately familiar with. And I'm not the only one, by the way. It's hard to sort through the data, but the best estimates that we have is that at least 1 in 3 women are going to experience depression by the time they turn 65 years old. For men, that number is 1 in 5. Before we started this series, we did like a little informal survey among you guys, and the results that came from that survey is that about 56% of people here at the Journey have struggled with depression at some point. Depression is something we see in the Bible. Psalm 42, day and night I have only tears for food while my enemies continually taunt me, saying, where is this God of yours? My heart is breaking as I remember how it used to be. I walked among the crowds of worshipers, leading a great procession to the house of God, singing for joy and giving thanks amid the sound of a great celebration. Why am I discouraged? Why is my heart so sad? I say I'm not a doctor, but that sounds to me like somebody who's struggling with depression. And just tip of the iceberg, I could spend the whole rest of my time just reading you passage after passage like this. And when you think about it, it's no surprise, right? Because life, if we're honest for a second, is incredibly painful and difficult. And so many of us, even in this room, have gone through some horrific things. When we think about the suffering and pain that exists of the world, it makes me wonder if the surprising thing should be that there's not more people that are depressed, not less. Which kind of takes me to the crux of the issue, that on one hand, we know that depression is a real thing, that even though we will all probably experience difficult moments and painful moments, for some of us, that sorrow and pain can stay with us and affect us in ways that messes with how we function in the world. And in the worst case scenarios, that can become a permanent experience. And even in some cases, it can get so bad that we start thinking that nothing is ever going to change and that we will never be happy again. And faced with the prospect of living a life like that, some start thinking that maybe it would be better to not go on living, and some even act on those thoughts. Depression is a real, serious thing. On the other hand, we know very little about how depression actually works. We don't fully know what triggers it. Sometimes it's a specific event like the loss of a loved one. Sometimes it's a result of trauma. Sometimes it's due to incredibly adverse life circumstances. Sometimes it's a physical issue triggered from anything from a bad diet to lack of sleep. In women, sometimes it can be the result of hormonal changes after childbirth. Talking as a pastor, not a medical expert, I would argue that sometimes there are spiritual factors that contribute to it, anything from our own sin and brokenness to the sin and brokenness of others, and even sometimes I would argue spiritual oppression. And yet, considering all those facts, sometimes we still don't know why it happens. There are people who wouldn't check any of those boxes and they still deal with depression. And to add to those two realities, there's also the fact that life goes on. Meaning that for those who are struggling with depression, even though your depression makes it so hard to function and even do basic things, the obligations you have to your family and friends are still there, right? The diapers still need to be changed and kids still need to be taken to school. You still have to show up for school or work and you're expected to do your job well. Your spouse or your significant other still expects you to be present for them. And these realities kind of like collide and create some tensions, right? For those experiencing depression, there is this confusion and frustration as to why this is happening to them. If you don't really know what's triggered your depression, there is this added sense of hopelessness, that you don't even know how to deal with it. If you're fortunate enough to have some sense of why it's happening, There is also the guilt and frustration that other people going through similar circumstances have not fallen into depression the way you have. So you think the problem is you, that you're weak or somehow defective. In other words, you feel that somehow your depression is your fault. That if you were stronger or braver, you wouldn't be going through this. And then there's the people in your life, because as I said, life goes on. And some of them are confused, especially if they have never experienced this. So they try to be helpful and patient and try to give you some space. And at the same time, they know and you know that they need you to show up. That they need you to help or work and provide and raise children and continue building this life together, or be a good friend or a good family member. And when those areas of your life start suffering, as inevitably they will do, there are tensions, the tension between giving you space and helping you while at the same time expecting you to show up to your life, which is also their lives, because you are loved and needed. And sometimes there is this either tacit or verbalized frustration on their end where they wonder, why can't you just be happy again? And you feel even guiltier, because there is nothing you want more than that. You give anything not to be depressed. And at the exact same time, you cannot conceive anymore the possibility of ever being happy again. They might as well be asking you to learn how to fly. So with all that said, let's go back to this thesis statement, right? It's okay not to be okay, and Jesus wants to make us whole. We're looking at what it's like to not be okay, but what could it possibly mean for God to make us whole in this thing? I want to take you to a passage. It might be an unexpected passage that's actually been incredibly helpful to me in this area. This is Genesis chapter 32. I'm going to start reading on verse 22. During the night, Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 servant wives, and his 11 sons, and crossed the Jabbok River with them. After taking them to the other side, he sent over all his possessions. This left Jacob all alone in the camp, and a man came and wrestled with him until the dawn began to break. When the man saw he would not win the match, he touched Jacob's hip and wrenched it out of his socket. Then the man said, "Let me go, for the dawn is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." You might wonder what this passage has to do with depression. It's a fair question. Bear with me, okay? Jacob is the grandson of Abraham, son of Isaac, and part of his story is that he's a twin. He's the younger, the twin that's born last. And by the time their dad is kind of like about to die, he's going to bless his children. And the way that the blessing works at that time, it's like the biggest thing that you can get, because it's kind of like your parent passing on the favor of God to you. And in that culture, the older son gets a bigger blessing. So Jacob knows that he's going to get the bigger blessing. And Jacob set up this whole situation to trick Isaac into him getting the blessing. And Esau wants to kill him for this. Jacob has to go on the run, and he's been living for decades with his uncle Laban. And this moment, God has told him to go back to where he's from, and he starts making his way back, and he hears that Esau is coming with 400 men, and he's worried that this is it. He's going to come with this army, and he's going to kill him, kill his family, his cattle, everything. So he sends everybody ahead of him to meet Esau. He says in the story that it's to soften Esau's blow, so like Esau maybe won't attack them if he doesn't see Jacob with them. I think Jacob's kind of a coward, and he's sending everybody ahead just in case, but that's neither here nor there. Anyway, Jacob's left by himself. And there by himself, he has an encounter with a man. And, some commentators think that might be an angel. Some commentators think it's what we call a theophany. A theophany, all that means is like a physical manifestation of Yahweh, of the God of the Bible. And what unfortunately in the past is kind of bizarre. Like they start wrestling, right? And I've thought about this story a lot throughout my life because of the underlying themes in it. Like if we assume that Jacob is wrestling with God, this is a story about a way of interacting with God that's not just platitudes or superficial prayers. It's a story about clinging to God, which is what happens when you're wrestling with somebody, right? While at the same time asking, I would argue, demanding, refusing to give up on this wrestling match with God until God answers your prayers. Jacob refuses to let go of God, even when it seems like God is sort of fighting against him. And that might sound odd, but I'm telling you, when I was going through my depression, That's exactly what my prayer life felt like. Like I was wrestling with God, because when you're in the middle of that type of situation, there's all sorts of thoughts going through your head, right? Like, where is God? Why isn't God answering my prayers? Why is God allowing this to happen? And in the middle of that, there's a couple of ways in which you can react. One way is that you give up. You give up on God, you give up on yourselves, and sometimes this means that we give up on life, that the whole thing is so crushing and agonizing. And if we're people of faith, we've been told our whole lives that if we cry out to God, God helps us. So what happens when he doesn't? At some point, the thoughts start rattling around that if God isn't even going to answer, then why even bother living if there is no hope? There's a song, any youth group kids from like the late 90s, remember Pedro the Lion? He has a song called Prison Paramedics, and in that song, there's a scene where there's a priest presiding over a funeral. And he's presiding over a funeral, he has a mental breakdown, and he says this in his sermon: "Lately, I have been wondering why we go to so much trouble to postpone the unavoidable and prolong the pain of being alive." That might sound really dark and really morbid to you, but if you ask somebody who is in the depths of despair and mental agony, who thinks that there is no hope of things ever changing, who thinks that they're condemned to a life of darkness and hopelessness, that seems like a valid question. So you guys, we've been reading a lot. One of my favorite books I've read during this time is a book called On Getting Out of Bed by Alan Noble. That's actually where I found that Pedro the Lion quote. And he kind of like reflects on his own mental health journey. And the argument that he makes is that regardless of what causes your mental health issues, regardless of whether you're having depression or anxiety, or regardless if life is just really hard, you still have to get up of bed in the morning. Just this. However you explain the difficulty of living in the modern world, whatever theory you accept, you're still stuck with the reality that a normal life includes a great deal of suffering. Ultimately, you must have some reason to put up with such a life, some reason for still getting out of bed, even when you know it will mean pain. Even though getting out of bed in the morning can be incredibly hard, each morning you must choose to get out of bed or not. All the medication and cognitive therapy and latest research and self-care in the world can't replace your choice. This decision can be aided by these resources, but never replaced by them, which means that you have to have an answer to a fundamental question. Why get out of bed? Or more bluntly, why live? And what Noble points out is that the problem that we have is that most of us only look inward to answer that question. And when you're in the middle of depression, what happens is that your depression kind of like distorts your experience of the world. So if you're only looking inward to answer that question, your answer is probably going to be no. But here's the thing. Our own experience is not enough of a data point to answer the question of why live. And the reason is because we didn't make ourselves. That one of the main Christian beliefs is that God is the author of life, which means that life is fundamentally a gift. When I think you're going to hear people that are struggling with depression, it's like, I didn't ask for any of this. And sometimes that will mean I didn't ask for my mental health struggle. Sometimes people are really asking, I didn't ask to be born. Life is suffering and nobody consulted me and I want to be a part of this. Job, by the way, thinks like this. In the book of Job, after Job endures all of his pain and suffering, he goes into this long extended poem where he curses the day he was born. And he says on Job 3:11, why wasn't I born dead? Why didn't I die as I came from the womb? That's such awful, painful, terrible language. But there are people in the world today that feel like that. I didn't ask for this. And you know what? He's right. None of us asked for this. We didn't ask to be born. But here's the thing. What for Job at this moment feels like this unbearable burden is also an immeasurable gift. Life, the experience of being alive, is both burden and gift. Why? Because the reality of living in a fallen world that's wrecked by sin is that what was meant only as a gift has now become a burden. Which means that on this side of eternity, we cannot have one without the other. The writer Frederick Buechner says it probably in the most poetic way, this: the grace of God means something like, here is your life. You might never have been, but you are. Because the party wouldn't have been complete without you. Here is the world, beautiful and terrible things will happen. Don't be afraid. I am with you. Nothing can ever separate us. You hear that beautiful and terrible things would happen. That's just the reality of being alive. It's the only way to live. But here's the thing. The Christian faith also believes is that, well, right now life is both burden and gift. It's not going to be a burden forever. The thing that God has been going through Christ is this fundamental reshaping of the world and reality so that at one point, the burden will go away and the gift will remain. But what we live on this earth, if we only focus on the burden, we miss out on the gift. One of the songs that we sang this morning was Christ Our Hope on Life and Death. And that song is actually inspired by the Heidelberg Catechism, which was like this 1500 kind of like statement of faith that the Reformed Church created to pass on the faith to new Christians. And it kind of like works like in a question-answer format. And the question, is the first question that the song comes from, is this: what is your only comfort in life and death? And the answer is that I am not my own, but belong body and soul in life and in death to my faithful Savior, Jesus Christ. God made us, and what the church believes, what I think is reflected in the page of Scripture, is that we were made out of love and for love. That even if there is pain and suffering in the world, that's not why God created humanity. Read through Genesis, read through the Psalms, the same, book that we read, all this, the depiction of depression and agony talks about the wonder of creation and how God made humans with intention and purpose and meaning. Life is a gift from God. And the meaning of life coalesces around the idea of love. That's what Jesus gets asked, right? What's the point of the law and the prophets? And Jesus' answer is love God, love your neighbor, and then what? Love yourself. That somehow the core of what it means to be alive is to love. That God made us because of love. And the reason why saying this is because there's this truth, right? Life is a burden of a gift. And a gift. Life is a gift. And love is a point. And in order for you to get out of bed in the morning, and in order for you to stay in that wrestling match with God, you have to look beyond yourself. And the only thing that allows you to look beyond yourself is love. Two ways. One is love for the people around you. As I said, my wife, man, kind of like did this one-woman intervention. I'll be honest, I didn't handle it that well when it happened the first time. Because I kind of felt like, and this is not what, I didn't think that this is what she meant, but it kind of felt like she was saying, like, it's your fault. Like the depression is your fault. That's not what she meant. But that's how I took it at the beginning. And it took me a while to realize that my depression had kind of like blinded me to the people around me. Because all the energy I had was on staying afloat. Every ounce of my self-focus and my attention was on like staying alive and taking the next step. And when I realized that this person in my life who I love was suffering, and when I was able to see that, that kind of like shook me out of that place of paralysis and allowed me to take the steps to get help. It was love that saved me. And the same thing is true in a relationship with God. I would argue that the reason why Jacob stays kind of like clinging to God is because even though he's wrestling with God, he believes that God loves him. Like if you read, we don't have time, but if you read through like the passage right before, you're going to see in the previous 2 chapters, Jacob over and over recounting all the ways in which God has been faithful to him. So on Genesis 32:26, when Jacob is hanging on to God and he's saying, I will not let you go unless you bless me, I think that there's a part of Jacob that believes that God wants and can bless him. But you have to believe that God loves you. And the problem is, again, because depression distorts your perception, at the moment, it doesn't feel like it. And the thing that is going to help you is looking to something else as evidence of God's love. Because for Christians, the evidence of God's love is not whatever current circumstance is. For Christians, the evidence of God's love is the cross. When Jesus is having dinners with his disciples before he's going to get arrested and crucified, he says to them, there is no greater love than to lay down one's life for one's friends. What Jesus is saying, what the Bible teaches, is that God has already proved that he loves you. The answer to the question, does God love humanity, has already been answered at the cross. The answer to the question, does God love you? Does God care about you? Has already been answered at the cross with a resounding yes. And in as much as we're able to see that and believe in that, we're going to be able to, like Jacob, stay clinging to God in this wrestling match. And this is why this is important. Because when we stay clinging to God, things happen. What happens next in the story? Verse 27, what is your name? The man asked. This is God or the angel, whatever he's wrestling with. He replied, Jacob. And he says, your name will no longer be Jacob, the man told him. From now on, you will be called Israel. Because you have fought with God and with men and have won. The result of Jacob wrestling with God and clinging to him and demanding that God blesses him is that God acquiesces. He blesses him. But he blesses him in a strange way. He doesn't grant him 3 wishes. He doesn't promise that he's going to survive his encounter with Esau. He doesn't reassure him about his current circumstances. He gives Jacob a new name. And the reason why it's important is because in ancient Near Eastern cultures, your name was your identity. It's like the core of who you were. The name Jacob, it kind of like means to it comes from the word for heel. The reason is because he was born grasping on his brother's heel. But in Hebrew, it sounds very similar to the word for deceive. So it became kind of like a play on words that Jacob was a deceiver, and Jacob lives up to that name, right? A couple chapters later, when Jacob steals Esau's blessing, Esau actually says, no wonder his name is Jacob. Look, he's deceiving me. It becomes a part of Jacob's identity. And you may think that that sounds ridiculous, and this is what happens in pre-modern cultures that have not discovered a scientific method, but how many of us are defined by the worst mistake that we've made? How many of us are defined by our struggle? It's not that we suffer from anxiety or depression or grief or trauma, it's that somehow we are. How many times have you found yourself saying, I'm an anxious person, I'm a depressed person? I know that some of these are just semantics and how we use language, but I would argue that underlying that, so often the struggles that we're going through become a label that defines our identity. They become, in many ways, our name. And in this encounter, when Jacob stays wrestling with God, when he doesn't give up on God, the blessing from God is that he gets a new name, which is to say, God's blessing for Jacob is that Jacob gets a new identity. Jacob is no longer defined by his worst mistake or by his worst character trait. He has a new name. The blessing that's found in wrestling with God, the blessing that's found in clinging on to God for dear life, like you're a castaway and God is a life raft. The blessing that's found in getting out of bed and showing up for our lives and showing up for our life with God is that in God's presence, we are reminded of who we truly are. That we're not just our depression or our anxiety or whatever mental health struggles we're going through. That we're not the diminished version of ourselves that we see in the mirror because of how our mental health has crippled us. We're more than that. We're sons and daughters of God, adopted by God, raised to life in Christ, blessed with every spiritual blessing, sitting in heavenly realms. I go on and on and on. And the reason why it's important is because in the midst of depression, as I told you, our view of reality becomes distorted. Not only in regards to our current situation, but in regards to our very identity and value as people. I think that Jen was saying that in one of the clips, right? Saying like, it felt like it affected my identity and who I was. And it's so easy to buy into that lie. But I want to tell you, it's a lie. If we're able to believe in the truth of God's love and cling on to God and not give up on Him, what happened is in the middle of that wrestling with God, God asked us the question that he asked of Jacob, what is your name? Which is another way of asking us, who are you? And then when we're honest and we say, I feel like I am blank. And that's not just mental health, by the way. That's, I feel like I am a divorced person, a single mother, an alcoholic, a failed business owner, a bad son, a bad parent, whatever it is. That thing that we feel like we are defines us. God looks at us and he says, no. I have given you a new name. You're my child. You're my son. You're my daughter. And I'm your father. That's the end of that. And let me tell you, some days, that's the only thing that will carry you through the day. When the lies that our own minds sometimes tell us feel so loud that we can't think straight. God's declaration of who we are is the thing that will keep us tethered to God, to our neighbors, to our loved ones, and sometimes it's the only thing that will keep us tethered to life. And I would argue that eventually, that's a thing that will see us through the other end of our mental health journey, whether in this life or the next. Take me to what happens next in the story, right? Verse 29, please tell me your name. Jacob asks, the man says, why do you want to know my name? Then he blessed Jacob there. Then when you go to verse 31, he says, the sun was rising as Jacob left Peniel, and he was limping because of the injury to his hip. Jacob makes it out of this encounter with God alive, blessed with a new name, and limping. And I love that. You know, we've been saying this idea that it's okay not to be okay, and Jesus wants to make us whole. And I believe that, I affirm that 100%, but the thing is that anybody that's struggled with mental health, you'll tell you it's not like a cold, right? It's not like one day you woke up and all the symptoms are gone, you're fine. It's like a journey, it has ups and downs. I'm great right now. I don't have to take medication. My therapist got like discharged because says you're making great progress, you're fine. But you know, part of what I discovered on myself in this journey is that I don't handle transition points and I don't handle uncertainty well. So part of me is like, you know, if Sean wakes up in a bad mood on Monday and fires me, the pressure might come back. And you joke about it, but no, but there's a part of me that really like doesn't fully know. And there was a moment in my life when that scared me because I felt like a cancer patient in remission, right? That you're good right now, but you never know what's going to change. And it almost feels like God hadn't fully healed me, that God hadn't fully kind of like come through for me. And what I love about this story is that in Jacob's case, that doesn't matter. And what I mean by saying that doesn't matter is that some of us feel like only when life is perfect, only when we don't have any more feelings of anxiety, any more feelings of depression, any more strange thoughts, when everything is right, that will mean that then we can experience the fullness of what God has for us. And Jacob doesn't care about that. He has to continue walking because life is there. And he's blessed, and he has a new identity, and he's limping. And every day for the rest of his life, he's going to have this reminder of both his humanity and his frailty, but also this reminder of God's goodness and his encounter with God. If you've noticed, every Sunday we've been playing before the sermon these bumpers with bits of interviews from people from our community that have shared their mental health stories. Actually, if you go to our YouTube page, we've published all those interviews in full. And I really want to encourage you to go and check them out because there are some beautiful, brave, vulnerable stories of people sharing. And the reason why we're doing that is not because it's a cool bumper. And it's not because we want to be like emotionally manipulative and kind of like get you in your feels before we come talk about the issues. The reason why we've been doing this is because we want you to see something. If you look around this room right now, everybody here is also walking with a limp. Some of our limps are the stuff that happened with our family of origin, and the divorce, the miscarriage, and the failed business, and the failed church, and the heartbreak and the poor relationship with her family, the depression, the anxiety, the trauma, the suicidal thoughts. The church is fundamentally a community of limp walkers. You know what happens? Because we've encountered God, because God has given us a new identity, because God has given us a new name, we keep walking. When my anxiety came back after the church closed, I started having all these intrusive thoughts, right? One of the thoughts I was having was this thought that I wasn't going to see my son grow up. And that shook me to a point that I need to get help. It's going to be happening. You know why? Because I'm going to see Jack, God willing, graduate high school. I'm going to see him graduate college, and I'm going to see him get married and have kids. I'm going to see Julia do the same things. I'm going to walk Julia down the aisle. I'm going to grow old with Megan. We're going to see the goodness of God, even if that means that I walk the rest of my life with a limp. I don't care as long as I'm walking. At the end of Jacob's life, he calls his son Joseph to give him a blessing. At this point, by the way, Jacob is in Egypt. All these things have happened, and he's giving his this blessing, and he says this. He says, "May the God before whom my grandfather Abraham and my father Isaac walked, the God who has been my shepherd all my life to this very day." You know what happens with Jacob after he walks out of the encounter? He meets Esau. He survives that encounter, but he goes to Canaan, and the love of his life dies during childbirth. And he spends decades believing that his favorite son had been mauled to death by a dead animal. And he has to leave his place of his home because of a famine. And he's able to look at that beautiful and terrible life, at that burden and gift that is life, and he's able to say, "The Lord has been my shepherd all the days of my life." Which takes me always to the famous passage in Psalm 23, right? "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." My favorite line from that passage is the last part of the verse. "Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life." A few years ago, I learned that in the Hebrew language, the word for follow that you see there, it's actually the same word that you use to talk about pursuing an enemy. Whenever you read that the people of Israel are on the run, they're being followed, they're being pursued. I love how the NLT translates the verse, because I think it's more accurate. It says, "Surely your goodness and unfailing love will pursue me all the days of my life." Jacob and the psalmist are able to look back at their lives with the beauty and the pain, with the children and the family and the love, and with the anxiety and the depression and the trauma and the grief. And in the midst of this, they're able to say that the goodness and mercy of God has been with them. And this is active language, right? Why? Because sometimes, let me tell you, it feels like the hounds of depression and anxiety are running after us. And when the psalmist is saying, yes, but guess what? The goodness and the mercy of God is also running after me. And guess who runs faster? That's the beauty of clinging to God, staying with Him. My encouragement for you this morning is, isn't that worth saying yes to life? Isn't that worth getting out of bed in the morning? Isn't that worth clinging to God? I think it is. And I want you to encourage you to believe that it is as well.